With the Jaguar suffering to obtain any sort of profit at all, Atari decided to release an add-on for the console in an attempt to revive it. With compact discs being the future and cutting edge in technology, Atari decided to release the Atari Jaguar CD add-on 2 years later. The peripheral sat atop the Jaguar console, snapping very firmly into the ROM cartridge slot. The Atari Jaguar CD featured a double-speed drive and a built-in virtual light machine software, which provided a very flashy and sophisticated video light show when an audio CD was played in the console. To encourage sales, the CD add-on came with Blue Lightning, VidGrid, the Tempest 2000 soundtrack, and a Myst demo disc. To allow more storage on the CD and foil piracy, the designers chose to ignore established CD-ROM formats and create their own proprietary format based on audio CDs. This allowed for Jaguar CD games to store as much as 790 megabytes of data, considerably more than already conventional CD-ROM games. The Atari Jaguar CD add-on was priced at about $150 and was marketed to an already lackluster selling console. Just after a few weeks the CD add-on launched, Atari boastfully commented saying that their entire inventory had been sold and that another batch would have to be ordered. This statement was actually true, but Atari failed to give further details about the situation they were in. The full truth was, Atari was bleeding profusely from a lackluster selling Jaguar and Jaguar CD, and talks about a merger with JT Storage were being discussed. So, on February 13th, 1996, JT Storage merged with video game console and former home computer producer, Atari Corporation. The company that founded and started the most successful home video game console in history, the Atari 2600, was out of money. JT Storage promised to keep both brands running, but by July 30th, 1996, the majority of Atari employees were dismissed, and Atari's remaining inventory was sold to liquidators. And going back to Atari's previous comment about all their Jaguar CD inventory being sold within weeks, that was true, but what they failed to mention was their entire Atari Jaguar CD inventory consisted of only 20,000 units. The Atari Jaguar would be the last console Atari would ever produce. Atari wasn't the only company fighting to get a second chance in the video game industry. With SNK's first lackluster selling console due to its high price, debuting in 1990, the Neo Geo AES, SNK had a second chance to redeem themselves in the video game industry. With many companies taking advantage of the cutting-edge technology in CDs, SNK saw this as an opportunity to jump ship as well. So in 1994, SNK released the Neo Geo CD in Japan, and shortly after in the United States. The AES tanked originally due to its high price in console and cartridge-based games. The CD console would fix this problem, but it created a new issue: loading times. Even though the Neo Geo CD was priced at a cheaper price than the original AES, the console was plagued with unbearable load times. The Neo Geo CD only had a single-speed CD-ROM drive, which had trouble loading larger game titles. This hurt console sales immensely. SNK was instantly notified about this problem soon after the release. So, to fix load times, some game content was removed, but in doing so, this reduced the game's overall quality. So to have a compromise between game quality and load times, SNK took the action to have a double-speed CD-ROM drive as their next console. This redesigned unit was called the Neo Geo CD-Z, released in Japan only. The reason for the limited Japanese release of the CD-Z was simple. The CD-Z had a hardware design flaw that would cause the console to overheat after limited gameplay. Eventually, SNK would find the newer competitors' consoles better capable of handling their ports of their games. Support for the console was dropped shortly after the company SNK filed for bankruptcy. The Neo Geo CD-Z would be SNK's final console in the video game industry. With Bandai's first failing console released in 1979, the Bandai Supervision 8000, in 1994 of September 23rd, Bandai tried again with the Bandai Playdia, released in Japan only. With the console having a smaller toy feel and having a kitty blue color, the Playdia was marketed for a younger audience. With the Playdia being a CD-based console, the Playdia could produce some very impressive anime FMV video clips. Most of the Playdia's titles, due to the younger audience, were edutainment games. However, the Playdia did have some franchise titles such as Gundam, Sailor Moon, Ultraman, and Dragon Ball Z. However, these games, just like RDI's Dragon's Lair, lacked real gameplay and mainly focused on FMV to deliver the experience. Unfortunately for Bandai, the Playdia was a giant flop and it did not sell well at all. Even though the Playdia was originally marketed towards a younger audience, Bandai, desperate for a profit, decided to throw these ideas out. Bandai changed their marketing strategy and decided to publish idol CDs for the Playdia, which featured young Japanese girls that took their clothes off at the player's command. Shockingly enough, this idea worked, and Bandai sold enough consoles to make a small profit. Even though Bandai had a dubious future with video games, they still had their hopes up and would try again later. After Capcom saw SNK's fall in the 1990s, in 1994, Capcom saw an opportunity to venture into the niche home video game market. But instead of making their own video game console or recreating their own arcade boards, they created an adapter that could work with them. This adapter was called the Capcom CPS Changer, or Capcom Power System Changer. The CPS Changer provided 2 joystick ports, a TV composite video output, a TVS video output, and a Q-Sound audio output. The reason why Capcom saw a necessity of the CPS in the market is because gamers enjoy popular arcade titles without Capcom having to pay royalties for home ports on other systems. It would be a win-win for both parties. However, price won again in deciding the fate of the Capcom CPS Changer. With just the price of one arcade board costing up to 20,000 yen or $200 in USD, gamers decided to go for the home console ports instead of the expensive arcade boards instead. In other words, Capcom actually successfully drove gamers to the home console ports instead of away from them as they planned. Due to these high prices, and also with the fact that home console ports were reaching near perfect arcade quality, sales for the Capcom CPS began to decline. Just 2 years later, in 1996, Capcom discontinued all support for the CPS Changer. With Sony and Sega planning to release their 32-bit consoles soon on the market, NEC wanted a piece of the pie themselves. The maker of the successful home video game console in Japan, the PC Engine, teamed up with Hudson Soft once again to create a 32-bit CD-based console. So on December 23rd, 1994, NEC and Hudson Soft released the NEC PC-FX. Uncommon to most console designs in the era, the NEC PC-FX strayed away from the common console form factor and resembled more of a PC desktop tower, and even had 3 expansion ports for additional upgrades and peripherals. NEC also decided to not follow the rules when it came to hardware as well. Instead of loading the console with 3D Gen hardware, they focused on the PC-FX as an awesome 2D game console, focusing on FMV and 2D capabilities. The PC-FX was capable of playing audio CDs, CDG, and codec CDs for viewing home photos. However, the PC-FX was most remembered for its mass anime and hentai game library. With the launch price of the PC-FX ranging to about $500 USD, the PC-FX was overshadowed with other Sega and Sony upcoming consoles and was met with a lackluster reception. With only 62 games being released for the console, NEC supported the PC-FX until 1998, but the console never saw outside of Japan. With more powerful game consoles being released, and the arcade games were evolving into the 3D world, the once dominant 16-bit Sega Genesis and Mega Drive were starting to feel their age. In winter of '94, Sega CEO Haya Nakayama directed Sega of America to produce a 32-bit cartridge-based consoles to be sold in Christmas the same year. This project was dubbed Jupiter. With the supervisor of Sega of America not happy developing a simple 32-bit cartridge-based console, Sega of America chose to make an add-on for the already existing Genesis and Mega Drive. This project was dubbed Mars. While the American division of Sega was busy building Mars, the Japanese department was building a completely new project dubbed Saturn. Saturn would be a state-of-the-art, CD-based only 32-bit console, and would be built to replace the Genesis and Mega Drive. Sega of America got to work quickly on developing for Mars, with no knowledge of the 32-bit CD-based console Saturn being developed by their Japanese counterparts. When Project Mars was finished on November 21st, 1994, its final name was the Sega 32X, or Super 32X, to emphasize the 32-bit capabilities. With this peripheral, gamers could play enhanced 32X cartridge games and use the cartridge slot as a way to pass through to play Genesis and Mega Drive games. Later on, the 32X's library had Sega CD 32X games, which were enhanced Sega CD 32-bit games. Despite Sega jumping into the brave new world of a 32-bit era, Mars was off to a bad beginning. One problem was the launch titles. When the 32-bit hit the market in North America, it only had 4 launch titles: Doom, Star Wars Arcade, Virtua Racing Deluxe, and Cosmic Carnage. Another issue the 32X faced was retailer demand. Retailers requested that they should receive 1 million units, but only half of the amount was made available. In Sega's attempt to scurry and meet market demand, Sega produced faulty 32X units with various defects. Customers reported inconsistencies in compatibility with their Genesis, Mega Drive models, and TVs. In an attempt to correct their shoddy manufacturing, Sega began to create multiple adapters to alleviate the compatibility problems customers faced. Sega was also in the works of developing an all-in-one unit, which had the Genesis, Mega Drive, and the 32X built inside of it. It was dubbed Neptune, once again named after a planet. However, a year later in '95, America finally got a hint that Sega of Japan was building a 32-bit CD-based console dubbed Saturn. Once this rumor was confirmed true by Sega of Japan, developers lost interest in the 32X and immediately abandoned all development with an already lackluster peripheral. Gamers, consumers, and developers decided to wait for a more favorable and state-of-the-art 32-bit CD format. On the same year in 1995, Sega ceased all support and development for the 32X in order to focus on Project Saturn. By '96, the 32X only had a pitiful library of 31 cartridge-based games, and 5 32X CD-enhanced games. Most were developed by Sega and were just color-enhanced versions of already existing Genesis games. Sega of America finally realized they were duped into just being used to fill the time gap for Saturn's development in Japan. And with all the cords and hardware that was connected with the Genesis with the Sega CD and 32X, the Genesis literally looked like it was on life support, and Sega discontinued all further developments in adding on devices. The 32X was Sega's first downturn. The lack of developer support, device inconsistencies, and abandonment of 32X owners was enough to damage Sega's reputation and contribute to problems for Sega later on. During this time, while Nintendo Super Nintendo was selling well, they didn't forget about their handheld Nintendo Game Boy. So in 1994, Nintendo decided to combine the two together. This combined project would be known as the Super Game Boy. The Super Game Boy allowed Game Boy games to be played on a television through a special cartridge inserted in the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom game console. Released in 1994 for a price of $60, this process allowed the Game Boy to survive longer than its planned shelf life. When a Game Boy game was played in the Super Game Boy, it added additional features, such as a border which wrapped around the video and sometimes expanded sound for games such as Wario Blast, Toy Story, Animaniacs, and A Bug's Life, just to name a few.